The door didn't just slam, it echoed like a final warning. Neighbors swear they felt the tension through the walls as Rasheeda stood frozen in the doorway, her voice trembling with rage, while Kirk Frost, yes, the same Kirk who always seemed so unshakable, completely broke down right there on the front steps. And this wasn't just another argument. This was the explosion fans never saw coming. Witnesses say Rasheeda didn't hold back. "You're done, Kirk, done," she allegedly shouted, pointing toward the driveway as if she was erasing him from her life in real time. But what truly shocked everyone wasn't her anger, it was Kirk's reaction. The man who usually deflects, jokes, or smooth talks his way out of trouble, collapsed emotionally. Tears, pleading, desperation. What pushed Rasheeda to this breaking point? Because insiders are now whispering that this wasn't about one mistake. It was about years of secrets, betrayals, and one final revelation that sent everything crashing down. And here's where it gets even messier. Sources claim this confrontation had been building for weeks, silent tension, cold stares, unanswered questions. But when the truth finally came out, Rasheeda didn't just confront Kirk, she exposed him. Right there, no cameras, no filters, just raw emotion and a relationship hanging by a thread. Fans are already calling it the most brutal fallout yet, and if what insiders are saying is true, this might not be something they can come back from. Because whatever happened behind that door, it changed everything. The moment the door slammed behind Kirk Frost, the silence outside felt heavier than the argument itself. He stood there, frozen, staring at the wood as if it might open again, as if this was just another fight that would blow over. But this time, it didn't. Inside, Rasheeda wasn't pacing anymore. She wasn't yelling. She was done. And somehow, that silence from her was louder than anything she had screamed just minutes before. "You really thought I wouldn't find out?" Her voice echoed in his mind, sharp, cutting, final. Just 10 minutes earlier, the house had been filled with chaos. "Stop lying to me, Kirk," Rasheeda had shouted, her hands shaking as she held up her phone. "I saw everything." Kirk had tried to keep his composure at first, running his hands over his face, pacing like he always did when things got uncomfortable. "You're overreacting. It's not what you think," but Rasheeda wasn't buying it anymore. "Not this time. Not what I think." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "So these messages, these receipts, this woman saying you promised her something, that's not what I think?" That word promised hung in the air like a threat. Kirk's face changed. For a split second, the confident man everyone knew cracked. And Rasheeda saw it. "Oh, so now you're quiet?" She stepped closer, her voice dropping. "Now you don't got anything slick to say?" He sighed, trying to regain control. "I was gonna tell you." "When?" She cut him off instantly. "After she showed up at my business? After she embarrassed me in front of my staff? After the whole world found out again? That's when things escalated. Because this wasn't just about betrayal. This was about humiliation. "You keep doing this to me," Rasheeda said, her voice breaking for the first time. "You keep putting me in these situations where I gotta defend you." Kirk shook his head, frustration creeping in. "You acting like I don't do nothing for you. Like I ain't been here, don't," she snapped, pointing at him. "Don't you dare try to flip this on me." The tension in the room became suffocating. And then, the truth slipped. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it changed everything. "It wasn't just messages," Kirk muttered. Rasheeda froze. "What did you just say?" He hesitated. And that hesitation confirmed everything. "Kirk," her voice dropped to almost a whisper, "what did you do?" He looked away, and that's when Rasheeda lost it completely. "Get out." The words came out fast, sharp, like she had been holding them in for years. "What?" Kirk blinked, genuinely shocked. "I said get out of my house," she repeated, louder this time. "You're not about to stand here and disrespect me again and think you're staying under my roof." Kirk tried to step toward her, lowering his voice. "Rasheeda, calm down, we can talk about this." "No," she said, backing away. "We've been talking. For years. And you keep doing the same thing." He reached for her arm, but she pulled away instantly. "Don't touch me." Those 3 words hit harder than anything else. For a moment, Kirk didn't know what to do. This wasn't the usual cycle. There was no negotiation, no cooling off period. This felt permanent. "You really kicking me out?" he asked, disbelief all over his face. Rasheeda didn't hesitate. "Yes," and just like that, it was over. Or at least, that's what it felt like. Now standing outside, Kirk finally let the mask fall. His shoulders dropped. His breathing got heavier. And then, the tears came. "Man," he muttered to himself, pacing down the driveway. "This can't be happening." But inside the house, Rasheeda wasn't crying anymore. She was shaking, leaning against the kitchen counter, staring at her phone, rereading the messages that had shattered everything. A close friend, who had arrived just minutes after Kirk was thrown out, found her there. "Sheeda," the friend said softly. Rasheeda didn't look up. "He really thought I wouldn't find out." Her voice wasn't loud anymore. It was cold. "What are you gonna do?" the friend asked carefully. Rasheeda finally lifted her head, her eyes filled with a mix of anger and something deeper, exhaustion. I'm done covering for him, and outside, things were already spiraling. Neighbors had started peeking through windows. Someone had already recorded part of the argument. Whispers were spreading fast. Fans would later say emotions ran high that night, but that didn't even begin to describe it. Because what nobody realized yet was that this situation was far from over. As Kirk sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel, trying to steady his breathing, his phone buzzed. He looked down, and whatever he saw on that screen made his face drop completely. Nah, he whispered, there's no way, because the drama that had just exploded inside that house? It was about to get even worse. Kirk stared at his phone like it had just betrayed him too, his thumb hovering over the screen as if not touching it might somehow change what he was seeing, but it didn't. The message was still there, bold and undeniable, and it wasn't from Rasheeda, it was from someone he clearly did not expect at a time like this. She knows everything, the message read, followed by a second one that made his chest tighten, and if you don't fix this, I will. Kirk exhaled sharply, leaning back in the driver's seat, running his hands over his face again, trying to piece together how things had spiraled this far out of control, because just hours ago he thought he still had time, he thought he could manage it, smooth it over, say the right words like he always did, but now, everything was collapsing at once. Inside the house, Rasheeda had finally dropped into a chair, her friend sitting across from her watching in silence, because even she didn't know what to say. How long? The friend asked quietly, and Rasheeda laughed, but it was bitter, hollow. Long enough to make me look stupid, she replied, gripping her phone tighter, scrolling through messages that now felt like knives. Every word Kirk had said, every excuse, every moment he made her question herself, it all started to line up in a way that made her stomach turn. He was living a whole different life, she whispered, shaking her head, right in front of me, and just then, her phone buzzed again. She looked down and froze, her expression changing instantly. What is it? Her friend asked, leaning forward, but Rasheeda didn't answer right away, because the message she just received wasn't just confirmation, it was escalation. It was the kind of information that doesn't just hurt, it destroys. Oh my god, she finally said under her breath, and without another word she stood up, pacing again, but this time her energy was different. It wasn't just anger anymore, it was something sharper, more focused. He lied about everything, she said, louder now, her friend standing up too. What do you mean everything? And Rasheeda turned to her, eyes blazing. I mean everything. Outside, Kirk was still sitting in the car, his leg bouncing nervously as he debated whether to call Rasheeda, to go back to the door, to try one more time, but deep down he knew that wouldn't work, not now, not after what he had just admitted, and definitely not after whatever she had just found out, because he knew Rasheeda. He knew that look she had right before she told him to get out, that wasn't just anger, that was final, and yet, he couldn't just drive away, he couldn't just leave things like this. Nah, I gotta fix this, he muttered, grabbing his phone again, scrolling to her name, but before he could press call, his phone rang, and when he saw who it was, his entire body stiffened. He hesitated, then answered. What? He said, his tone already defensive. The voice on the other end didn't waste time. You didn't tell her everything, did you? Kirk clenched his jaw, looking out the windshield. This ain't the time, he replied, but the voice cut him off. No, this is exactly the time, because now she's hearing it from someone else, and that's when it hit him. Whatever Rasheeda had just seen, it didn't come from him, and that meant the situation was now completely out of his control. Who told her? Kirk demanded, sitting up straighter, but the answer he got only made things worse. Does it even matter? The voice replied coldly. You should have been honest from the start. Kirk ended the call abruptly, tossing the phone onto the passenger seat, his frustration boiling over. This is crazy, he said out loud, but even he didn't sound convinced, because deep down, he knew this wasn't just bad luck, this was the result of choices he had been making for a long time. Back inside, Rasheeda had stopped pacing, she was standing still now, staring at one specific message on her screen, rereading it over and over again as if hoping it would somehow change, but it didn't. It only became more real, more painful. He can't talk his way out of this, she said firmly, her friend watching her closely. You sure you don't want to hear him out? The friend asked carefully, but Rasheeda shook her head immediately. For what? So he can lie again? Her voice cracked slightly, but she quickly steadied herself. No, I've heard enough. And just then, there was a knock at the door. Both women froze, exchanging a quick look, because they both knew who it was. Don't open it, the friend said quietly, but Rasheeda didn't move right away. The knock came again. Louder this time, more urgent. Rasheeda, please. Kirk's voice came through the door, strained, desperate. Just let me explain. Rasheeda closed her eyes for a second, taking a deep breath, and for a moment it looked like she might actually go to the door, like she might give him one more chance to speak, but then she looked down at her phone again, at the message that had changed everything, and her expression hardened instantly. No, she said, more to herself than anyone else. The knocking continued. Rasheeda, come on, Kirk called out, his voice breaking slightly now. Don't do this. And that's when Rasheeda finally walked toward the door, her friend watching nervously, unsure of what she was about to do. Rasheeda stopped just inches away from opening it, placing her hand on the handle, but instead of turning it, she spoke, her voice loud enough for him to hear clearly. You should have thought about this before. There was a pause on the other side, then Kirk spoke again, softer this time. I messed up, I know that, but we can fix this. Rasheeda let out a slow breath, shaking her head even though he couldn't see her. No, Kirk, she said firmly, you messed this up, and I'm not fixing it for you anymore. Outside, Kirk stood there, his hand resting against the door, his forehead leaning against it as her words sank in, because this wasn't the usual back and forth, this wasn't a fight that would cool down in a few hours, this felt like something else entirely, something heavier, something final. So that's it? He asked quietly, but there was no response, just silence, and that silence said everything. Kirk stepped back slowly, looking at the door one last time before turning away, his chest tight, his mind racing, because for the first time, he wasn't sure how to come back from this, and as he walked back toward his car, he had no idea that the situation was about to explode even further, because across town, someone else was already preparing to step into this drama, someone who had been watching everything unfold, waiting for the right moment, and now, that moment had arrived across town. The tension wasn't just building, it was boiling over, because the person who had been quietly sitting in the shadows of this entire situation was no longer willing to stay silent. And as Kirk pulled away from the house, his mind racing, trying to figure out his next move, he had no idea that another storm was already forming, one that would hit even harder than what he had just left behind. His phone buzzed again, but this time he didn't even look at it right away, he just kept driving, gripping the steering wheel tighter, replaying everything in his head. Every word Rasheeda had said, every moment he hesitated, every mistake that had led to this point. How did it get this bad? He muttered under his breath, but deep down he knew exactly how. It wasn't one moment, it wasn't one lie, it was a pattern, and now that pattern had caught up to him in the worst way possible. Meanwhile back at the house, Rasheeda had finally sat down again, but her mind wasn't slowing down, if anything, it was moving faster, connecting dots she had ignored for too long. Moments that didn't make sense before now suddenly felt crystal clear. He really thought he could keep this from me forever, she said quietly, almost to herself, her friend watching her closely, unsure whether to speak or just let her process everything. What are you gonna do if he comes back again? The friend finally asked, and Rasheeda didn't even hesitate this time. He's not coming back, she said firmly, but even as she said it, there was a flicker of something in her eyes, not doubt exactly, but the weight of everything they had built together, everything they had been through, and how quickly it all seemed to be falling apart. Just then, her phone rang, and when she looked down, her expression changed again. This time it wasn't anger, it was something else, something more complicated. Who is it? Her friend asked, and Rasheeda hesitated before answering. It's her, she said, her voice low, and the room immediately felt heavier, because they both knew exactly who that meant. Rasheeda stared at the screen for a few seconds longer before finally answering the call, putting it on speaker without saying a word. There was a brief silence on the other end before the voice came through, calm, almost too calm. So, you finally know. Rasheeda's jaw tightened instantly. You got a lot to say for someone who's been hiding, she shot back, and the voice on the other end let out a small laugh. Hiding? No, I wasn't hiding, I was just waiting for the truth to come out. Rasheeda shook her head, pacing again. The truth? Or your version of it? She fired back, her tone sharp, but the woman didn't back down. The version where he didn't tell you everything, she replied, and that was enough to push Rasheeda even further. Then say it, Rasheeda demanded, stopping in her tracks. Say whatever you think I don't know. There was a pause, just long enough to build tension, before the woman spoke again, and when she did, her words hit like a bomb. He didn't just lie to you, he made promises to me. Rasheeda's face hardened instantly, her friend watching in shock as the situation escalated in real time. What kind of promises? Rasheeda asked, her voice dangerously calm now, and the answer that came next only made everything worse. The kind you don't make unless you're planning to leave. The room went completely silent. Rasheeda didn't move, didn't speak, didn't even blink for a moment, because what she had just heard wasn't just betrayal, it was a complete shift in everything she thought she knew. You're lying, she finally said, but there was a crack in her voice this time, something she couldn't fully control. Am I? The woman responded, her tone almost sympathetic now, because I've got proof of everything. Rasheeda clenched her phone tighter, her emotions threatening to spill over again, but she forced herself to stay composed. Send it, she said simply, and just like that, the call ended, leaving behind a silence that felt suffocating. Seconds later, Rasheeda's phone buzzed again, message after message coming through, and as she opened them, her entire expression changed. The anger, the hurt, the disbelief, it all blended into something heavier, something deeper. Oh my God, her friend whispered, watching her reaction, but Rasheeda didn't respond right away. She just kept scrolling, taking it all in, every screenshot, every message, every piece of evidence that painted a picture she couldn't ignore anymore. He was really planning a whole other life, she said finally, her voice low, almost numb now, and at that exact moment, Kirk's car came to a stop at a red light, his phone lighting up again on the passenger seat. this time he glanced at it. And what he saw made his heart drop instantly, because it wasn't just one notification, it was dozens, messages, missed calls, tags, everything coming in at once, and when he opened one of them, his entire body went cold. Nah, no, he said, shaking his head, because whatever had just been sent to Rasheeda was now starting to spread, and not just privately, but publicly. Fans were already reacting, screenshots were circulating, people were connecting the dots faster than he could even process them. This can't be happening, Kirk muttered, gripping the wheel tighter as the light turned green and cars behind him started honking, but he didn't move right away, because for the first time, it wasn't just his relationship on the line, it was his reputation, his image, everything. And back at the house, Rasheeda finally stopped scrolling, setting her phone down slowly as if it weighed too much to hold anymore. Her friend stepped closer, placing a hand on her shoulder. You okay? She asked softly, but Rasheeda didn't answer right away. She just stared ahead, her mind processing everything she had just seen, everything she had just learned, and when she finally spoke, her voice was different, not loud, not emotional, just clear and certain. He thought he could play me, she said, and there was a finality in her tone that hadn't been there before. But he played himself, and outside, the world was already reacting, fans were shocked, emotions ran high, and the family was left divided as everyone tried to figure out what was real, what wasn't, and what would happen next, because at this point, this wasn't just a private situation anymore, it had turned into something much bigger, something messier, something that no one could control. And as Kirk finally drove off, one thought kept repeating in his head over and over again, this isn't over, not even close. Kirk barely made it 2 blocks before pulling over again, his hands trembling now as he tried to process the flood of notifications lighting up his phone, every vibration feeling like another piece of his world cracking apart. He opened social media and instantly froze, because it was everywhere, screenshots, captions, accusations, fans dissecting every detail in real time. Fans are shocked was already trending, people arguing, taking sides, dragging his name through the mud, and what made it worse was that the information being shared wasn't vague, it was specific, it was detailed, it was undeniable. This is bad, this is really bad, he whispered, running his hand over his mouth, because this wasn't just gossip, this was exposure. And back at the house, Rasheeda hadn't moved much from where she stood, but internally everything had shifted. The pain was still there, sharp and heavy, but now it was layered with clarity, a kind of clarity that only comes when denial finally disappears. Her friend tried to speak again, but stopped when she saw the look on Rasheeda's face. It wasn't just anger anymore, it was resolve. I'm not going through this again, Rasheeda said quietly, almost like she was making a promise to herself. And just then, another knock came at the door, but this time it wasn't Kirk. Both women looked toward it, confused, cautious, and when Rasheeda approached and opened it slightly, her expression shifted instantly, surprise mixed with tension, because standing there was someone she didn't expect to see face to face. Not tonight, not like this. We need to talk, the woman said, her tone steady but serious, and Rasheeda stepped back slowly, letting her in without a word, her friend watching closely as the energy in the room shifted yet again. Because now this wasn't just about messages or screenshots anymore, this was direct confrontation, the kind that forces everything into the open whether you're ready or not. So you decided to show up, Rasheeda said, crossing her arms, her voice calm but guarded, and the woman nodded slightly. I figured it was time you heard everything without a screen in between, she replied, and for a moment, no one spoke, the weight of everything hanging thick in the air, until Rasheeda finally broke the silence. Then talk, she said, her tone sharp, because I'm done guessing. The woman took a breath, glancing briefly at Rasheeda's friend before focusing back on her. He told me things, she began, choosing her words carefully, things that made it seem like you two were already over. Rasheeda let out a short, disbelieving laugh, shaking her head. Of course he did, she muttered, but the woman continued, her voice steady. He said he was staying out of obligation. That things weren't what they looked like. That sentence hit harder than Rasheeda expected, not because she believed it, but because of how easily it fit into the pattern she had been ignoring. And you believe that? Rasheeda asked, raising an eyebrow, and the woman didn't hesitate. I believed what he showed me, she said, pulling out her phone, and what he showed me was someone who had already checked out. Rasheeda looked at the screen being held out to her, more messages, more proof, more pieces of a story she never agreed to be part of, and for a moment, the room felt like it was closing in. He made me look like a fool, Rasheeda said, her voice low now, and the woman across from her nodded slightly. He made both of us look like fools, she replied, and that shared realization hung between them, uncomfortable but undeniable. Meanwhile, Kirk was still sitting in his car, watching everything unfold online in real time, his name being dragged, his actions being questioned, his character being dissected by people who only knew pieces of the story. They don't know everything, he said to himself, but even as he said it, he knew that didn't matter, because what was already out there was enough to damage everything. He scrolled further, seeing comments piling up faster than he could read them, people bringing up his past, connecting it to the present, saying this was a pattern, saying this was who he really was, and that word pattern stuck with him, because it wasn't the first time he had heard it. Rasheeda had said it too, more than once, and now it was echoing everywhere. This ain't how it's supposed to go, he muttered, frustration building again, but this time there was something else mixed in, something closer to panic. Because he wasn't just losing control of the situation, he had already lost it, and back at the house, the conversation had shifted again, the initial tension giving way to something more revealing, more raw. Did he ever tell you the truth about anything? Rasheeda asked, her tone calmer now but still firm, and the woman hesitated for a second before answering. I think he told versions of the truth, she admitted, and Rasheeda nodded slowly, because that made sense, it fit, that's what he does, she said, more to herself than anyone else, he gives just enough to keep you from asking more questions. Her friend finally spoke up, unable to stay silent any longer. So what now? She asked, looking between the two women, and that question lingered for a moment, because the answer wasn't simple, it wasn't immediate, but Rasheeda eventually straightened up, her expression firm again. Now? She repeated, and then she took a deep breath. Now I stop letting him control the narrative, and with that, she reached for her phone again, her fingers moving quickly as she started typing, her friend watching closely. What are you doing? She asked, and Rasheeda didn't look up. Finishing this, she replied, and within seconds, her post went live, a message that was short but powerful, direct but loaded with meaning, and almost instantly, the reaction was explosive, notifications pouring in, comments, shares, support, speculation, everything hitting at once, and Kirk felt it immediately, his phone lighting up again. But this time he didn't need to check to know what had happened. She posted, he said under his breath, closing his eyes for a second as the reality of it all settled in, because this wasn't just private anymore, this wasn't something he could fix behind closed doors, this was public, permanent, and moving faster than he could keep up with. Emotions ran high, didn't even begin to cover it now, because this had turned into something bigger than just a relationship falling apart. This was a full unraveling, and as both sides stood in completely different places, one inside a house filled with truth and confrontation, the other alone in a car filled with regret and damage control, one thing became painfully clear, there was no going back to what things used to be, and whatever happened next would change everything for good. The moment Rasheeda's post went live, everything escalated in a way nobody could control. Within minutes the internet was flooded with reactions, fans were shocked, emotions ran high, and the family was left divided as people started picking sides without even knowing the full story. Kirk's phone wouldn't stop ringing now. Calls from friends, business partners, even people he hadn't spoken to in years suddenly wanting answers, but he ignored most of them, staring at Rasheeda's post like it was the final confirmation that this was no longer something he could contain. She really did it, he muttered, his voice low, almost defeated, because her words weren't just emotional, they were calculated, they were clear, and they made it obvious that she wasn't protecting him anymore, not even a little bit. Back at the house, Rasheeda stood still after posting, watching the reactions come in, her face unreadable, her friend stepping closer. You sure about this? She asked carefully, but Rasheeda didn't hesitate. I should have done it a long time ago, she replied, and there was no regret in her tone, only certainty. The woman who had come to confront her earlier stood quietly off to the side now, almost like she understood that whatever role she had played in exposing the truth was over. This was now between Rasheeda and Kirk, and there was nothing left to hide. Just then, Rasheeda's phone rang again, and when she saw the name, her expression shifted slightly, not anger this time, but something more controlled. She answered without putting it on speaker. What? She said, her voice calm but firm. On the other end, Kirk didn't even try to pretend anymore. Why would you do that? He asked, his voice strained, and Rasheeda let out a small, almost tired laugh. Why would I do that? She repeated, you really asking me that right now? Kirk sighed heavily, running his hand over his face, pacing beside his car. You didn't have to take it public, he said, but Rasheeda cut him off immediately. You made it public the second you started living like you didn't have a wife. Her words hit hard, and for a moment, Kirk didn't respond, because there was nothing he could say that wouldn't make things worse. We could have handled this differently, he finally said, but even he didn't sound convinced, and Rasheeda shook her head even though he couldn't see her. No, you could have handled this differently, she corrected, her voice rising slightly now, but you didn't, so this is what it is. There was a pause, heavy and uncomfortable, before Kirk spoke again, softer this time. So that's it. You just done? And Rasheeda didn't answer right away, because despite everything, despite the anger, the betrayal, the humiliation, there was still history there, years of it, but that history wasn't enough anymore, not after everything she had seen, everything she had learned. I'm done letting you make me look stupid, she said finally, her voice steady. And that answer told Kirk everything he needed to know. He leaned against the car, closing his eyes for a second as the weight of it all hit him again, harder this time, because now it wasn't just an argument, it was final, or at least it felt that way. You not even gonna hear me out? He asked quietly, one last attempt, but Rasheeda's response didn't change. I've been hearing you out for years, she said, and every time, it's the same thing, different excuse, same outcome. Kirk exhaled slowly, realizing that he was running out of options, out of words, out of ways to fix this, and for the first time, he didn't try to argue, he didn't try to defend himself. He just stood there in silence, because deep down, he knew she was right. Back inside the house, Rasheeda ended the call without another word, setting her phone down as her friend looked at her. That's it? she asked, and Rasheeda nodded slowly. That's it, she confirmed, and there was something about the way she said it that made it clear she meant it this time, not like before, not like the other times when things got bad and then somehow worked themselves out. This was different, this felt final. The woman who had come earlier finally spoke again, her tone softer now. I didn't come here to make things worse, she said, and Rasheeda looked at her, her expression calmer now. You didn't, she replied, you just told the truth, and while that truth had hurt, it had also given her something she didn't have before, clarity. And across town, Kirk was still standing there, his phone buzzing nonstop, his world shifting faster than he could keep up with. He looked down at the screen again, seeing more reactions, more comments, more people weighing in on something that had once been private, and now he had to face the reality of it all, not just the public backlash, but the personal consequences, the loss of trust, the damage that couldn't be undone with words this time. This really might be over, he said quietly, and as those words settled in, they felt heavier than anything else that had happened that night, because no matter how many times things had fallen apart before, there was always a way back, always a conversation, always a second chance, but this time, it didn't feel like there was one, and as the night stretched on, both of them sat in completely different spaces, physically and emotionally, processing everything that had just happened, everything that had led to this moment, and everything that might come next, because even though this chapter felt like it had reached its breaking point, the story itself was far from finished, and the question now wasn't just what happened, but what happens next. As the night dragged on, the weight of everything that had unfolded refused to settle. It only grew heavier with every passing minute. Kirk finally got back into his car but didn't start it, just sat there staring ahead like he was stuck between what had already happened and what he knew was coming next, his phone still buzzing non-stop, but now he wasn't even reacting to it, because the noise from the outside world had become irrelevant compared to what was happening inside his own head. Every memory with Rasheeda started replaying, the good moments, the bad ones, the times he thought he could fix things with a few words, the times she forgave him when maybe she shouldn't have, and now all of it felt like it was crashing down at once. I really messed this up, he said under his breath, his voice breaking slightly, and for the first time that night, there was no defensiveness left, no excuses, just the raw realization that he had pushed things too far this time. Meanwhile, back at the house, Rasheeda had moved from the kitchen to the living room, sitting on the couch but not really resting, her mind still racing, her phone lighting up constantly with messages of support, questions, even pressure from people close to her asking what she was going to do next, but she ignored most of them, because this wasn't about outside opinions anymore, this was about her finally deciding what she was willing to accept and what she wasn't. Her friend sat beside her quietly, giving her space but staying close enough to step in if needed. You okay? She asked again softly, and Rasheeda nodded, but it wasn't a simple yes, it was the kind of nod that said she was holding it together, not that she was fine. I will be, she said, and there was strength in that answer even if the pain hadn't fully faded. Across town, the situation was still spreading like wildfire. Fans were shocked, emotions ran high, and the family was left divided as more people began to speak out, some defending Rasheeda, saying she had every right to finally draw a line, others questioning Kirk, bringing up his past and calling this moment a long time coming, and then there were those who still believed he deserved another chance, that relationships like theirs were complicated, layered, not something that could be judged from the outside, but Kirk wasn't focused on any of that anymore. He finally picked up his phone again and opened Rasheeda's post, reading it over slowly this time, really taking it in, every word, every implication, and what hit him the hardest wasn't what she said, but what she didn't say. There was no anger in it, no insults, no emotional outburst, just a clear message that she was done protecting him, done covering for him, done carrying the weight of his choices, and that silence spoke louder than anything else. She's serious, he whispered, and for the first time, the idea that this might actually be the end didn't feel like a possibility, it felt like reality. Back at the house, Rasheeda finally stood up again, walking toward the window and looking out into the dark, not expecting to see anything but still needing the moment, her reflection staring back at her, a mix of strength and exhaustion. I gave him too many chances, she said quietly, almost like she was admitting it to herself, and her friend didn't argue, didn't try to soften it, because she knew it was true. So what happens if he comes back tomorrow? Her friend asked, and Rasheeda didn't turn around, didn't hesitate. Then he comes back to someone who's not the same anymore, she replied, and that sentence carried a weight that made it clear this wasn't just about ending something, it was about changing something within herself, something that had been building for a long time, and now finally reached its breaking point. At the same time, Kirk finally started the car, but he didn't drive far, just moved enough to feel like he wasn't stuck, like he was still in control of something, even if it was small. His mind kept going back to one question: is there any way to fix this? And no matter how many times he asked it, the answer didn't come, because deep down, he knew this wasn't something that could be fixed with a conversation, not this time, not after everything that had come out. everything that had been exposed, everything that had been said, and as the hours passed, the distance between them felt bigger than ever, not just physically, but emotionally, mentally, permanently, because this wasn't just another chapter in their story. This felt like the closing of one, the kind that doesn't leave room for easy rewrites or quick reconciliations, and yet, despite how final it all felt, there was still an underlying tension, a sense that something else was coming, because situations like this don't just end quietly, they ripple, they spread, they evolve. And as both of them sat in their separate spaces, processing, reflecting, and bracing for what might happen next, one thing was undeniable: nothing would ever be the same again, not for Kirk, not for Rasheeda, and not for anyone who had been watching this unfold from the very beginning, because what started as a private argument had turned into something much bigger, something that would leave a mark long after the noise died down. And even though the night was coming to an end, the story was far from over. In fact, it felt like it was only just beginning by the time the sun started to rise. Neither of them had slept. The night had stretched into something endless, heavy with everything that had been said and everything that hadn't. Kirk found himself parked outside a quiet street miles away, staring at nothing, his phone now silent for the first time in hours, but the silence didn't bring relief. It only made his thoughts louder, sharper, impossible to ignore. This can't be how it ends, he said to himself, but even those words felt weak now, because for the first time, he wasn't sure if he believed them. He leaned back in his seat, closing his eyes briefly, but all he could see was Rasheeda standing there, telling him to get out, her voice steady, her expression final, and that image wouldn't leave him alone. Back at the house, Rasheeda was still awake too, sitting in the same spot but feeling like everything around her had changed. The quiet morning light coming through the windows making the house feel unfamiliar, like it no longer held the same meaning it once did. Her friend had fallen asleep on the couch beside her, but Rasheeda hadn't moved, her phone resting in her hand, the screen dim but still filled with everything that had happened overnight, messages of support, headlines forming, people already turning their situation into a story bigger than just them. And while fans were shocked and emotions ran high, what mattered most to her now was the realization that she had finally reached a point she couldn't walk back from. "I'm not doing this again," she whispered to herself, her voice calm but certain, and that certainty felt different this time, stronger, like something had shifted permanently inside her. Just then her phone buzzed again, but this time it wasn't another notification from the outside world. It was a message from Kirk, simple, direct, and almost unexpected. "Can we talk, for real this time?" Rasheeda stared at it for a moment, her thumb hovering over the screen. Because this was the moment that would define everything that came next, not just for him, but for her too. She could respond, open the door again, allow another conversation, another explanation, another cycle, or she could finally close it for good, and the weight of that decision sat heavily in her chest. Meanwhile, Kirk sat in his car waiting, staring at his phone like it held his future. Because in a way, it did. Every second that passed without a reply made the tension worse, made the possibility of losing everything feel more real. "Just answer," he muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible. And back in the house, Rasheeda finally took a deep breath, her expression steady as she looked down at the message one last time. All the memories, all the pain, all the lessons from the past few hours and the past few years coming together in that single moment. And then slowly, deliberately, she began to type, her fingers moving with a clarity she hadn't felt in a long time. When she finished, she didn't hesitate, she pressed send, and just like that, the message was gone. Out there, irreversible. Kirk's phone buzzed almost instantly, his heart racing as he grabbed it, unlocking the screen with shaky hands, and when he read her response, everything inside him went still, because her words weren't angry, they weren't emotional, they were something else entirely, something calm, something final, and that's what made them hit even harder. He leaned back in his seat again, staring at the screen as the reality of it all settled in. Because sometimes it's not the loud moments that change everything, it's the quiet ones, the decisions made without chaos, without noise, just clarity, and this was one of those moments. Across town, Rasheeda set her phone down again, her shoulders relaxing slightly for the first time all night, not because the pain was gone, but because the uncertainty was. She had made her choice. And there was power in that, even if it came with consequences. Her friend stirred beside her, waking up slowly. "What happened?" she asked, her voice still heavy with sleep, and Rasheeda looked at her, a calm expression on her face that hadn't been there before. "I chose me," she said simply, and those 3 words carried more weight than anything else that had happened. Because at the end of all the drama, all the exposure, all the chaos that had unfolded, that was what it came down to, not just what Kirk had done, but what she was no longer willing to accept. And as the morning fully arrived, bringing with it a new day, a new reality, and a completely different future than the one either of them had expected, one thing became undeniable. This wasn't just the end of a fight, it was the end of something much bigger, something that had been holding on by a thread for far too long. And now that thread had finally snapped, leaving both of them to face what comes next, separately, differently, and without the illusion that things could ever go back to the way they were. Because some moments don't just change your situation, they change you, and this was one of those moments. The hours that followed didn't bring closure, they brought consequences, and those consequences started showing up faster than either of them expected. Kirk was still sitting in that same car when the realization fully hit him, not just that Rasheeda meant what she said, but that the version of her he had relied on for years, the one who would eventually listen, eventually forgive, eventually allow things to settle, that version was gone, and what stood in its place now was someone he didn't fully recognize, someone who had drawn a line he couldn't cross back over. She really done this time, he said quietly, almost like he was trying to convince himself it wasn't true. But every second that passed without another message, without another chance, made it more real, and while he sat there trying to figure out what to do next, the outside world wasn't slowing down. If anything, it was speeding up. Blogs were picking it up, people were analyzing every detail, fans were shocked, emotions ran high, and the family was left divided as relatives and close friends began reaching out to both sides, some urging Rasheeda to stand firm, reminding her of everything she had already endured, others calling Kirk, telling him to fix it before it was too late. But what nobody seemed to understand was that it might already be too late. Back at the house, Rasheeda had finally moved from the couch, walking slowly through each room like she was seeing it differently now. Every corner held a memory, every space carried a reminder of what they had built together, and what had now fallen apart. But instead of breaking down, she stayed composed, her expression steady, because this wasn't about what she was losing anymore, it was about what she was refusing to lose again, her peace, her dignity, her sense of self. And as she stood there in the middle of it all, her phone buzzed again, but this time she didn't rush to check it, she let it sit for a moment, taking control of the situation in a way she hadn't before. When she finally looked, it wasn't Kirk, it was someone close to him, someone who had clearly heard everything by now. You two need to talk before this goes too far, the message read, and Rasheeda stared at it for a second before letting out a slow breath, because that phrase, too far, felt almost ironic now, as if everything that had already happened somehow wasn't far enough. It already did, she said quietly to herself, and instead of replying, she locked her phone and set it down again, choosing silence over engagement, something that would have been hard for her before, but now felt necessary. Across town, Kirk finally stepped out of the car, stretching slightly like he had been sitting in the same position for too long, because he had, but even as he moved, nothing felt different, the weight was still there, the tension still sitting heavy in his chest. He checked his phone again, scrolling through messages he didn't know how to answer, advice he didn't know how to take, and opinions he didn't want to hear, because none of it changed the one thing that mattered, Rasheeda's decision, and as much as he wanted to believe he could still change that, he was starting to understand that this wasn't something he could control anymore. What do I even do now? He asked out loud. But there was no answer, just the quiet hum of the world moving around him like nothing had happened, even though for him, everything had. And back at the house, Rasheeda finally stepped outside, the fresh air hitting her face as she took a deep breath, like she was resetting, grounding herself after everything that had unfolded. The world outside looked normal, calm, unchanged. But she knew things were different now, permanently different, and as she stood there, she realized something she hadn't fully processed until that moment. She wasn't just ending something, she was starting something new, something uncertain, something that would require strength in ways she hadn't needed before, but also something that would no longer come with the same pain she had been carrying for so long. I'm not going back, she said softly, and this time, there was no hesitation, no second guessing, just certainty. And miles away, Kirk stood there with the opposite realization settling in, that he wasn't just losing a relationship, he was losing the version of his life that had allowed him to move without consequences, to make mistakes and still find his way back, because this time, there was no way back. And as both of them stood in their separate spaces, facing completely different futures, one thing became clear, this wasn't just a dramatic moment that would fade with time, this was a turning point, the kind that changes everything that comes after it, the kind that forces you to grow whether you're ready or not. And while fans continued to react, while emotions continued to run high, and while the family remained divided trying to make sense of it all, the truth was much simpler and much heavier at the same time. Two people had reached a point they couldn't come back from, and no matter how loud the outside noise got, no matter how many opinions were shared, that reality wasn't changing, because some endings aren't temporary, some endings don't leave room for negotiation, and this was one of them. As the day fully unfolded, the reality of what had happened began settling into something even heavier than the chaos of the night before, because now there was no distraction, no shouting, no adrenaline, just the quiet aftermath of decisions that couldn't be undone. Kirk had finally made his way to a different location, somewhere more private, but even there he couldn't escape what was happening. His phone continued to light up with updates, more people weighing in, more speculation, more judgment, and even though he tried to ignore it, every notification felt like another reminder that this situation had grown beyond him, beyond Rasheeda, beyond anything he could fix with a conversation. This really got out of hand, he said under his breath, but deep down he knew it didn't just get out of hand, it had been building to this point for a long time. Meanwhile, Rasheeda had shifted into a completely different mindset. She wasn't reacting anymore, she was moving with intention, slowly but deliberately, going through her day in a way that felt unfamiliar but necessary. She spoke to a few close people, kept her circle tight, and avoided anything that would pull her back into the emotional chaos of the night before. Because now it wasn't about reacting, it was about maintaining the boundary she had finally set, and that boundary was being tested almost immediately. Messages continued to come in from mutual friends, from people who had been around both of them for years, all saying different versions of the same thing. Maybe you should talk, maybe there's more to it, maybe this can still be fixed. But Rasheeda didn't engage with any of it, because she understood something they didn't. This wasn't about one moment, it was about a pattern, and patterns don't change overnight. Across town, Kirk was having the opposite experience, because everywhere he turned, people were expecting him to explain himself, to defend himself, to somehow undo what had already been exposed. But he didn't have the answers they wanted, he barely had answers for himself. Every explanation he thought of felt incomplete, every excuse sounded weak even in his own head, and for the first time, he wasn't trying to convince anyone else, he was struggling to convince himself. I should have handled this different, he admitted quietly. And that admission carried a weight he couldn't ignore anymore, because it wasn't just about what he had done, it was about how long he had been doing it, how many chances he had been given, and how each one had led to this exact moment. Back at the house, Rasheeda sat down again, her phone in her hand but her attention elsewhere, thinking about everything that had happened. Not just in the past 24 hours, but over the years, the ups and downs, the public moments, the private conversations, the times she chose to stay, the times she almost walked away but didn't, and now, finally, the moment she actually did. I stayed too long, she said quietly, not with regret, but with understanding, and that understanding was what made this different, what made it final. Because it wasn't driven by anger anymore, it was driven by clarity, and as the hours passed, the outside noise continued. Fans were shocked, emotions ran high, and the family was left divided, but inside, both of them were dealing with something much more personal, much more permanent. Kirk finally sat down, putting his phone aside for the first time, trying to sit with the reality of everything without distraction, but that only made it louder, because now there was nothing to block out the truth, nothing to soften it, nothing to delay it. I lost her, he said, and even though the words were simple, they carried the full weight of everything that had happened, everything that had led to this point, and everything that couldn't be undone. And at the same time, Rasheeda sat in her own space, feeling that same weight from a different perspective, not of losing someone, but of finally letting go, and while that came with pain, it also came with a sense of relief she hadn't felt in a long time, a sense that she was no longer carrying something that wasn't hers to carry. And as the days slowly moved forward, both of them began to understand that this wasn't just a temporary separation, this wasn't just another chapter in an ongoing story, this was a turning point, a moment that would define everything that came after it. And even though there were still questions, still emotions, still pieces of the situation that hadn't fully settled yet, one thing was already clear: nothing was going back to the way it was, not this time, not after everything that had come out, everything that had been said, everything that had been exposed, because some moments don't just change your situation, they change your direction entirely. And as both of them faced that reality in their own way, one thing became undeniable: this wasn't just the end of something, it was the beginning of something completely different, something neither of them had planned for, but something they now had to face whether they were ready or not. As the situation continued to unfold over the next few days, what once felt like a single explosive moment turned into a chain reaction that neither of them could escape, because now it wasn't just about what happened that night, it was about everything that came after. Kirk had tried to step back from the noise, avoiding public appearances, limiting conversations, hoping that time would somehow slow things down, but instead it only gave people more space to talk, more room to speculate, more time to dig into every detail of his past and connect it to the present. And the narrative forming around him was one he couldn't easily change. People weren't just reacting to what Rasheeda had exposed, they were revisiting everything, every previous issue, every moment that had once been brushed off or forgiven, and now those moments were being re-examined under a completely different light. It's all catching up now, he admitted quietly, sitting alone as he scrolled through headlines that didn't paint him in any kind of favorable way. And while part of him wanted to push back, to defend himself, to explain his side, another part of him knew that no explanation would undo what had already been seen, what had already been proven. Back at the house, Rasheeda had shifted even further into her new reality. She wasn't just reacting anymore, she was rebuilding, slowly but intentionally, creating space between herself and everything that had caused her pain. She rearranged things, changed routines, made small decisions that symbolized something bigger, because this wasn't just about removing Kirk from her life, it was about redefining her own, and while that process wasn't easy, it was necessary. Her circle remained close, supportive, protective even, because they knew how much she had gone through to reach this point, and they weren't about to let her fall back into something that had already taken so much from her. Still, the outside pressure didn't disappear, if anything it intensified. Interviews were being requested, statements were being expected, people wanted her to speak, to confirm, to explain, but Rasheeda chose silence, not because she didn't have anything to say, but because she had already said enough, and she understood that not every truth needed to be repeated to be real. Across town, Kirk was facing a different kind of pressure, because silence for him wasn't being interpreted the same way. It was seen as avoidance, as guilt, as confirmation. And that only made things worse. I can't just sit here, he said, pacing again, the frustration returning but now mixed with something deeper, something closer to regret, because for the first time he wasn't just upset about the situation, he was starting to understand his role in creating it. Every decision, every moment he chose not to be honest, every time he thought he could manage the truth instead of facing it, all of it had led here, and now there was no way to go back and change it. Meanwhile, the people around them continued to react, friends choosing sides, family members caught in the middle, conversations happening behind closed doors that only added more layers to an already complicated situation. Some believed this was long overdue, that Rasheeda had finally done what she should have done years ago. Others believed that relationships like theirs deserved another chance, that history and time meant something, but what none of those opinions could change was the fact that the decision had already been made, and it wasn't theirs to reverse. Back at the house, Rasheeda stood in front of the mirror one morning, looking at herself in a way she hadn't in a long time, not searching for answers, not questioning her worth, just seeing herself clearly, and in that moment, there was a quiet strength that hadn't been there before. I'm not the same anymore, she said softly, and it wasn't a loss, it was growth, even if it came through pain. Across town, Kirk sat in a similar moment of reflection, but his felt different, heavier, filled with the realization of what he had lost and why. I thought I had more time, he admitted, shaking his head, but time was exactly what he had run out of, and as both of them continued moving forward in completely different directions, the story that had once connected them so tightly began to separate into two very different paths, one focused on rebuilding and reclaiming, the other on reflecting and facing consequences. And while fans were still shocked, while emotions still ran high, and while the family remained divided trying to process everything, the truth had become something much simpler. This wasn't about drama anymore, it was about change, real, irreversible change, the kind that forces you to confront who you've been and decide who you're going to be next. And as days turned into a new routine, as the noise slowly started to fade into the background, what remained was the impact of that one night, that one decision, that one moment when everything finally came to a head and couldn't be ignored anymore, because some stories don't end with a dramatic final scene, they end with a quiet shift, a realization, a choice that changes everything moving forward, and this was one of those stories, the kind that doesn't just stay in the moment, but carries into everything that comes after it, shaping it, redefining it, and making it impossible to ever go back to what it once was. In the weeks that followed, what once felt like chaos slowly transformed into something quieter but far more permanent, because the noise had faded, the headlines had slowed, and the constant buzz of opinions had started to die down, but what remained was reality, and reality didn't come with distractions, it came with clarity. Kirk had begun to feel that shift in a way he couldn't ignore anymore. The silence around him wasn't peaceful, it was heavy, filled with everything he hadn't said when he had the chance, everything he hadn't done when it mattered most. He found himself revisiting moments over and over again, not to justify them anymore, but to understand them, to finally see them from a perspective he had avoided for years. I really thought I could keep things separate, he admitted quietly one afternoon, sitting alone, but everything always comes together in the end, and that realization didn't come with anger, it came with acceptance, something that had taken him far longer than it should have. Meanwhile, Rasheeda had settled into a different kind of rhythm, one that felt unfamiliar at first but gradually became something she could stand on. Her days were no longer centered around managing someone else's actions or reactions, they were focused on her decisions, her boundaries, her peace, and while the absence of what she once had was still noticeable, it didn't feel like a loss in the same way anymore. It felt like space, and space gave her room to breathe in a way she hadn't in a long time. This is what it feels like, she said to herself one morning, standing by the window with a calm expression that spoke louder than any words. Across different circles, people were still talking, but the tone had changed. It wasn't as loud, not as reactive, it had shifted into reflection, conversations about lessons, about patterns, about knowing when enough is enough, and while fans had once been shocked and emotions had run high, now there was a different kind of understanding forming, one that recognized that what happened wasn't just sudden, it was the result of something that had been building for years. And as that understanding grew, so did the realization that not every situation is meant to be fixed, some are meant to end. Kirk began to see that more clearly with each passing day. The idea of reaching out again crossed his mind more than once, the thought that maybe enough time had passed, maybe things had cooled down, maybe there was still a chance to talk, but every time he considered it, he stopped himself, not out of pride, but out of understanding, because he knew now that what Rasheeda had done wasn't a reaction, it was a decision, and decisions like that don't come undone easily. I can't keep expecting another chance, he said quietly, and that sentence alone marked a shift in him that hadn't been there before. Back at the house, Rasheeda continued moving forward in her own way, not rushing, not forcing anything, just allowing things to unfold naturally, and in that process she started reconnecting with parts of herself that had been pushed aside for too long. Things she had once enjoyed, goals she had once set, pieces of her identity that had nothing to do with the relationship she had just left behind. And while it wasn't always easy, while there were still moments where the past tried to creep back in, she didn't let it take control because she had already made the decision that mattered most, and everything after that was about honoring it. Across town, Kirk was learning a different kind of lesson, one that didn't come with immediate relief, one that required sitting with discomfort, with accountability, with the understanding that some things can't be undone no matter how much you wish they could be, and while that process wasn't easy, it was necessary, because without it, nothing would actually change. This is on me, he admitted one evening, not to anyone else, but to himself, and that honesty, even if it came late, was something he couldn't ignore anymore. As time continued to pass, the connection between them didn't completely disappear, it lingered in memories, in shared history, in moments that couldn't just be erased, but it no longer held the same power it once did. It no longer dictated their choices or defined their direction, it became something else, something that existed in the past rather than controlling the present, and that shift, while subtle, was significant because it marked the difference between holding on and letting go, and both of them, in their own ways, had started to let go, not all at once, not without effort, but steadily, intentionally, and as that process continued, one thing became more and more clear: what happened that night wasn't just an ending, it was a turning point. The kind that forces growth whether you're ready for it or not, the kind that changes how you see yourself, how you move, how you choose, and even though fans had once been shocked, even though emotions had run high and the family had been left divided, what remained now wasn't the drama, it was the impact, the lasting effect of a moment that had shifted everything. And as both of them continued forward on separate paths, facing different challenges, learning different lessons, and building different futures, one truth stood out above everything else: some endings aren't meant to be rewritten, they're meant to be understood, accepted, and used as the foundation for something new, and this was one of those endings after everything that's come out. After the arguments, the exposure, the emotional breakdown, and that final decision, one question still remains: was this really the end for Kirk Frost and Rasheeda, or is there still something left unsaid? Because let's be real, relationships like this don't just disappear overnight. Years of history, love, betrayal, forgiveness, all of that doesn't just fade away without leaving something behind. And even though Rasheeda made it clear she's done, fans are still divided. Some believe she finally chose herself and made the right move, while others think Kirk might still find a way to come back from this. But here's the bigger question: if someone shows you the same pattern over and over again, do you keep giving chances, or do you walk away for good? This situation has people talking everywhere, and honestly, it's not as simple as it looks. Emotions ran high, the family was left divided, and now both of them are facing completely different futures. But what do you think? Do you think Rasheeda made the right decision kicking Kirk out and cutting him off completely? Or do you believe Kirk deserves one last chance to fix everything? Drop your thoughts in the comments right now, because this conversation is far from over, and your opinion matters more than you think. And if you want more intense stories like this, more shocking drama, and all the latest updates that fans are talking about, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss a single upload. Because trust me, this story might be ending, but the drama? It's just getting started.